My name is Clara, and for 35 years, I balanced the books for a small school district in Oklahoma. I was good at it. Numbers made sense to me. They were clean, logical, and they always told the truth, even when people didn't. After my husband, David, passed away, the numbers in my own life stopped adding up. The silence in our little house grew louder than any memory, and the solitude I once cherished began to feel like a weight. So, I did what seemed logical. I sold the house, the place where David and I had built a life and raised our only son, Mason. It was time, I told myself. Time to be near family, to feel the warmth of a home buzzing with life again. I packed the essential pieces of my life into a few dozen boxes, photographs, David's favorite books, my mother's china, and hired a moving service to send them ahead. For myself, I bought a one-way bus ticket to Flagstaff, Arizona. Mason had been enthusiastic on the phone. "It'll be great to have you, Mom," he'd said, his voice bright with a sincerity I wanted to believe in. His wife, Heather, had followed up with a text message, a single thumbs-up emoji. In the quiet emptiness of my life then, that was more than enough. I saw it as an invitation, a green light signaling a new chapter. The journey on the bus was a long, slow unwinding of the landscape and the tension I'd been holding in my shoulders for 2 years. The flat, familiar plains of Oklahoma gave way to the rolling hills of New Mexico, and finally, to the majestic, pine-covered mountains surrounding Flagstaff. I watched the world change through the wide window and let myself dream. I pictured mornings on their back patio with a cup of coffee, the scent of pine in the air. I imagined helping my granddaughter, Molly, with her homework, the way I used to help Mason. I could almost smell the roast chicken I'd make for Sunday dinners, filling the house with a scent of comfort and belonging. A warmth spread through my chest, a feeling so foreign and so welcome it almost brought me to tears. Mason was waiting for me at the bus station, just as he promised. He looked tired, older than I remembered, with fine lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But he smiled, a genuine, warm smile that for a moment made him look like the little boy I remembered. We hugged, a real hug, and he took my suitcase, making a light-hearted joke about how I hadn't aged a day. I laughed, a sound born more of relief than humor. The knot of anxiety in my stomach began to loosen. Their home was lovely, a 2-story house nestled in a quiet subdivision, with crisp white trim and a meticulously kept garden. A new, expensive-looking SUV sat in the driveway, and a set of delicate wind chimes on the porch sang a soft, melodic tune in the breeze. For a fleeting, hopeful moment, I allowed myself the fantasy that I had truly come home. But the feeling dissolved the moment we stepped inside. The interior was just as beautiful, modern, minimalist, and immaculately clean, but it was cold. Heather was at the kitchen island, her focus entirely on her laptop. She glanced up, offered a thin, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and gestured vaguely down the hallway. "So glad you could make it, Clara," she said, her voice smooth but distant. Mason picked up my suitcase again. "Come on, Mom, I'll show you where you'll be staying," he said, and his tone had shifted. It was the same one he'd used on the phone, but now it sounded less like an invitation and more like a line he had practiced. He led me past the living room, down a short hallway to a door at the back of the house. He opened it to reveal a steep flight of wooden stairs leading down. The air that rose to meet us was cool and carried the distinct, earthy smell of old paint and damp concrete. At the bottom of the stairs, I stood holding my suitcase, my purse clutched tightly in my other hand, and stared into the dim, cavernous space. "It's just temporary," Heather called from the kitchen, her voice echoing slightly in the stairwell. "It's quiet down here," Mason added, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. "You'll have your privacy." They said the words like a well-rehearsed duet. I said nothing at all. I just nodded, a small, automatic gesture of compliance. But deep inside, in a place I hadn't visited in a long time, something had already shifted. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a quiet, sinking feeling, a premonition that I had traveled all this way only to arrive in a place where I was not truly meant to be. That night, lying on the thin mattress, listening to the low, rhythmic hum of the water heater and the furnace, I felt the truth of it settle in my bones. The ceiling above me was a tangle of exposed pipes and wiring, a stark reminder that this space was not finished, not meant for living. I was here to be with family, I reminded myself, closing my eyes against the harsh glare of the single, bare light bulb. But the silence that enveloped me didn't feel peaceful. It felt like an erasure, a quiet, efficient tucking away, as if I had stepped out of my old life and into the shadows of theirs. Let me know where you're listening from. A soft voice on a podcast I sometimes listen to would say, and if any part of this story sounds like something you've lived through yourself. Lying there in the dark, I thought of those words and felt a tremor of recognition. This story was just beginning, and already I had a feeling I knew how it might go. The mattress was the kind you find in a summer camp cabin, thin and unyielding, with springs that protested every small movement. I learned to lie perfectly still, my hands folded over my chest, and stare up at the skeleton of the house above me. The exposed bulb in the corner cast long, dancing shadows that made the space feel both vast and suffocating. There was no window to let in the moonlight, no clock to mark the passing of the night. The only sounds were the mechanical sighs of the house, the low groan of the furnace, the shudder of pipes when a toilet flushed upstairs, and the persistent, slow drip from a leaky valve somewhere in the darkness. I told myself it was fine. Temporary. A week or two, at most. Maybe they really were planning renovations. I didn't need much, I reasoned. A bed to sleep in, a roof over my head. But the image of them standing at the top of the stairs, smiling their polite, distant smiles as they directed me down into the cold, stayed with me like a splinter, too small to cause real pain but impossible to ignore. Dinner that first night had set the tone. Heather had prepared a quinoa salad with roasted vegetables, food that was aesthetically pleasing but left me feeling vaguely hungry. Mason spent most of the meal scrolling through his phone, offering distracted hums in response to my attempts at conversation. Their daughter, Molly, a quiet girl with her father's eyes, was absorbed in a game on her tablet. I asked her about her favorite subject in school, and Heather intercepted the question before it could land. "We're focusing on screen-free family time at the table, Molly," she said gently, before turning to me with a smile that was all teeth. "She has so much pressure at school. We try to make home a sanctuary." The message was clear. I was an outsider to this sanctuary's rules. When the meal was over, I gathered my plate and silverware to take to the sink. Heather waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, don't worry about that, Clara. We have a system. Everyone is responsible for their own dishes." So I washed my plate, dried it with a paper towel, and placed it in the dish rack, feeling Heather's eyes on me the entire time, as if I had just committed a subtle but significant social error. Later that evening, I crept upstairs for a glass of water. The house was dark and silent. As I passed their bedroom, I heard the low murmur of their voices from behind the closed door. I paused, my hand on the cool kitchen counter. Mason's voice rose slightly, laced with exhaustion. "I just need some space, Heather. I'm drained." Heather's reply was softer, but carried a sharp edge. "We talked about this. Boundaries are important. We just have to manage the pressure." I backed away slowly, my bare feet silent on the cold tile. I didn't want to hear any more. Back in the basement, I sat on the edge of the mattress, the cold glass of water in my hand. My eyes fell on the door at the top of the stairs. There was a small, brass slide lock on it, on their side. I hadn't noticed it before. I couldn't be sure if it had been there all along, or if someone had quietly slid it into place after I went downstairs. I didn't sleep that night. My body ached from the long bus ride, but a deeper ache had settled in my heart. I had come here seeking connection, a sense of purpose. Instead, I felt like a ghost, haunting the fringes of their well-ordered lives. I was not just invisible. I was an inconvenience, a piece of old, sentimental furniture they didn't have the heart to throw away, so they stored it in the basement until they could figure out what to do with it. By the third morning, I'd found a rhythm born of self-preservation. I would wake before the sun, tiptoe up the creaking stairs to the kitchen, and make myself a cup of coffee. I'd sit on the back patio, wrapped in my old cardigan, watching the sky lighten over the pine trees, and I'd retreat to the basement as soon as I heard the first footsteps overhead. It was easier to be absent than to be in the way. That morning, however, I was too slow. Heather found me at the sink, rinsing my coffee mug. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there with her arms crossed, her perfectly manicured fingernails tapping a silent, impatient rhythm against her silk robe. Her expression was a masterclass in polite disapproval. "We have a system, Clara," she said finally, her voice smooth as river stone. "Everyone cleans their own things. It's about boundaries." There was that word again. A shield she used to keep the world, and me, at arm's length. I nodded, dried my hands, and stepped away from the sink, a quiet apology in my posture. I spent the day trying to be useful in ways that wouldn't cross any invisible lines. I took out the recycling bins. I weeded a small patch in the garden. I folded a basket of laundry that had been sitting in the basement for days. But the more I did, the more I felt Heather's quiet resentment. My small acts of help were not seen as kindness, but as intrusions. That afternoon, hoping to find a way to contribute that would be welcome, I offered to buy groceries for the week. It felt like a solid, tangible way to ease their burden. Mason's face lit up with relief. "Wow, Mom, that would be amazing. Thanks." Heather said nothing, but a few hours later, a piece of paper appeared on the small table next to my mattress. It was a grocery list, meticulously typed and itemized, with prices from their preferred organic market listed next to each item. The total was calculated down to the penny. Below the grocery list, there was another line, under a separate heading, Household Projects. It read, Roof Repair Estimate, $8,000. Beside it, in neat, cursive handwriting, she had added a small note, not urgent, but any contribution would be deeply appreciated. I stared at the number, my mind struggling to process the audacity of it, veiled as it was in polite suggestion. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my purse. No one mentioned it at dinner. Instead, over a meal of takeout pizza that Molly had requested, Heather casually brought up school supplies. "Molly's getting to the age where she really needs her own laptop for her projects," she said, glancing at me. "Something reliable. They run about $1,200 these days." Mason, chewing his pizza, added, "And the brakes on the SUV are starting to squeal again. The mechanic quoted me around $600. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He didn't look at me, but the question hung in the air between us. I heard myself say, "I can help with that." It was an automatic response, the conditioned reflex of a mother who had always fixed things, always filled the gaps. They both smiled. This time, Heather's smile seemed a little more genuine. After dinner, as I started to clear the pizza boxes, she gently steered me away from the table. "You relax, Clara. We've got this." She handed me a glass of wine and gestured toward the patio. "Why don't you enjoy the evening air?" I stood outside in the growing twilight, the cool breeze doing little to calm the unease in my chest. Through the screen door, I could hear their voices, low and conspiratorial. "I told you she'd catch on," Heather said, her voice a soft murmur. "Just give her time," Mason replied. "The basement is fine for now," she continued, "but we'll have to be more direct if we want to get the rest of it settled." I didn't know what the rest of it was, not yet. But standing there, clutching a glass of wine I didn't want, a slow, cold dread began to seep into my heart. I was being managed carefully and deliberately. All the gentle tones, the polite smiles, the talk of systems and boundaries, it wasn't about creating a harmonious home. It was a strategy. And I was not a beloved mother or a welcome guest. I was the target. The following week unfolded with a quiet, predictable rhythm. The requests for money were never demands. They were suggestions, dropped into conversation with calculated casualness. A text from Heather with a link to Molly's school fundraiser, noting that the top donors would be recognized in the newsletter. An invoice for the car repair left on the kitchen counter with a sticky note that simply read, FYI. A casual mention from Mason over breakfast that their quarterly home insurance payment was due. I paid for it all. I wrote a check for the fundraiser. I left cash in an envelope for the breaks. I transferred money for the insurance. It was easier than confrontation, and a part of me, the part that still desperately wanted to be needed, convinced myself that this was just what families did for each other. I had the savings from the sale of my house, a comfortable cushion that I had imagined would see me through my retirement. Now, I watched it shrink in small, steady increments. But it wasn't the money that bothered me most. It was the transaction. Each time I gave, I received a polite, fleeting thank you from Heather, the kind of acknowledgement one gives to a service worker, efficient and devoid of warmth. I was becoming their personal ATM, and my password was maternal guilt. One afternoon, while I was folding a basket of towels in the basement, I heard Mason's voice drifting down from the vent in the ceiling. He was on the phone, his tone low and earnest. No, it's fine, we can cover it, he was saying. We've got some family support right now. Yeah, my mom is staying with us for a while. It's working out. He was talking to a creditor, I realized. Or a loan officer. And I was family support. I was the reason it was working out. I was no longer a person in their story. I was a plot device, a financial solution. That evening, a new message from Heather popped up on my phone. It was a link to a Google spreadsheet she had created. The title was Clara's Monthly Contribution. It was a meticulously organized budget with line items for shared utilities, grocery and household supplies, and a new category, General Household Fund. The total at the bottom was a neat, round $800. My name was listed at the top, as if I were a tenant. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling slightly. I had just spent the afternoon making Mason's favorite dinner, roast chicken with rosemary, garlic mashed potatoes, and a green bean casserole, a meal that was an apology for my very existence, a plea to be seen as more than a burden. He had eaten 2 helpings, smiling and saying it was just like when he was a kid. Even Heather had seemed to relax, just for an hour. Now, the warmth of that shared meal had evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard lines of a spreadsheet. They had eaten my food, accepted my love, and then sent me an invoice for it. I didn't reply to the message. I closed my phone and lay down on the lumpy mattress, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin. In the darkness of the basement, I did the math. In just a few short weeks, I had given them nearly $3,000. It hadn't been taken by force. It had been given, willingly at first, then out of a weary sense of obligation. They had chipped away at my finances and my self-worth with such quiet, polite precision that I had barely noticed until now. They didn't leave bruises. They left a void, a hollow space where my trust in them used to be. It was late, well past 10, when I ventured upstairs. The house was shrouded in a deep silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. A sliver of light glowed from beneath Mason and Heather's bedroom door. I moved with the practiced quietness I had adopted, my goal nothing more than a glass of cold water from the kitchen tap. But as I passed the hallway, their voices, muffled but clear, drifted through the thin wood of their bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. We have to make a decision soon, Heather was saying, her tone calm, almost clinical. The market is shifting. That house won't stay in her name if we want to leverage it. We need to act. Mason's reply was a low murmur. I know, but the timing. We have to be careful. If we push too hard, she might. She might what? Heather's voice cut through his, sharp and impatient. Mason, let's be realistic. She won't be around forever. The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. I froze, my back pressed against the cool drywall of the hallway, the empty glass trembling in my hand. They weren't fighting. This wasn't an argument fueled by anger or frustration. It was a business meeting, a strategy session. And I was the primary obstacle, an aging asset with a finite lifespan. The house. My house. The house I had helped them buy nearly 20 years ago when Mason's first business venture had failed, leaving his credit in tatters. To secure the loan, the mortgage had been put in my name. David and I co-signed, with the understanding that they would refinance as soon as they were back on their feet. It was meant to be a temporary arrangement, a safety net. But the years went by, their finances stabilized, and the topic of refinancing never came up. I never pushed it. I trusted them. Now, that trust felt like the most profound foolishness of my life. I was not just their bank, I was their collateral. The next morning, I waited until the house was empty. The sound of their SUV pulling out of the driveway was my signal. I went down to the basement and pulled my largest suitcase from under the bed. At the very bottom, beneath a layer of winter sweaters I hadn't yet unpacked, was a worn leather portfolio. Inside were the original documents for the house. The deed, the mortgage agreement, the property tax statements from the first 5 years. My name and David's were on every page, our signatures clear and strong. I laid the papers out on the small folding table, the one that served as my nightstand. I remembered the day we signed them, the pride I felt in being able to give my son a foundation, a place to build his own family. I remembered Mason's tearful gratitude, the way he had hugged me and promised he would make us proud. Now, listening to the echo of Heather's words, "She won't be around forever," I finally understood. I wasn't the foundation. I was the placeholder. A legal convenience they were waiting to outlive. When Heather returned that afternoon, she was all smiles and buoyant energy. "Clara, I was thinking we should start planning Molly's birthday party. Maybe a barbecue in the backyard? I'd love your help with the menu." She was trying to draw me back in, to smooth over any potential cracks with the balm of inclusion. I smiled back, a calm, steady smile that felt entirely new on my face. "I'd love to help, Heather," I said, my voice even. Later that day, when I was alone again, I carefully placed the original documents back in the portfolio. I slid it into my suitcase, but this time, I zipped it shut and left the handle facing out where I could grab it quickly. Not because I was planning to run, but because for the first time, I understood that the game had changed. The door to this chapter of my life hadn't just been closed on me, it had been left strategically ajar, just enough for the cold, hard truth to slip through. And from now on, I would be watching that door with both eyes wide open. That night, sleep was a distant country I couldn't reach. The familiar hums and creaks of the basement sounded different, ominous. I sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark, the chill of the concrete floor seeping into my feet. I wasn't crying. The time for tears had passed. What I felt was a profound, hollow stillness, the kind that comes after a great shock, when the world has tilted on its axis and you are left trying to find your balance. I replayed the conversation I'd overheard, Heather's casual, dismissive tone as she discussed my mortality as if it were a line item in her financial plan. I had given them that house. Not as a loan, not as an investment, but as a gift of love and faith. For my entire life, I had subscribed to the unspoken creed of motherhood: you sacrifice. You give so your children can have more. You step back so they can step forward. It is a quiet, noble erosion of the self, done in the name of love. But the creed never tells you what to do when your children take what you've given and then turn around and act as if you are the one in their debt. It never prepares you for the moment you realize they have forgotten you are a person, not just a resource. In the pre-dawn gloom, I got up and stood in the center of the basement. My eyes traced the unfinished walls, the exposed beams, the clutter of their forgotten things piled in the corners. My gaze fell upon a faded red line drawn in chalk on the concrete wall, about waist high. Next to it, in a child's clumsy scrawl, was a date from 25 years ago. It was Mason's 11th birthday, The year he fell out of the old oak tree in the backyard and broke his arm. I remembered holding him, his face buried in my shoulder, his small body trembling with sobs for a full hour. I ran my fingers along that dusty red line, a ghost of a memory. And in that moment, something inside me cracked open. Not with pain, but with a fierce, clarifying anger. This wasn't just their house. This had been my house. My signature secured it. My husband's and my savings paid the down payment. My hands had helped Mason's father lay the tile in the kitchen. My paychecks had covered the mortgage more than once when Mason was between jobs. This basement, this cold, dark room they had relegated me to, had once been a playroom, filled with his toys and laughter. It was a space that held our history, and they had turned it into my cage. I had allowed it to happen. I had enabled it with every quiet nod, every polite smile, every check I wrote without question. Not because I was a fool, but because I had desperately wanted to believe that love would be the currency that mattered. That morning, I went upstairs and made the coffee, just as I always did. But I didn't retreat. I sat at the gleaming kitchen island, in the very spot where Heather usually worked, and I waited. The sun rose, casting long golden shafts of light across the perfectly polished floor. I looked at the neatly labeled spice jars, the bowl where Mason tossed his keys, the minimalist art on the walls. It was a beautiful stage, and they were very convincing actors. But I was done playing my part. I was no longer a guest. I was no longer a mother in the way they understood the term. I had become a liability, and I knew what was coming next. The polite smile, the gentle ask, and the rustle of papers. This time, I would be ready. By the end of the week, a profound calm had settled over me. It wasn't the peace of resignation, but the quiet strength of resolve. The door in my mind, the one I had left open, waiting for them to walk through with love and appreciation, had finally clicked shut. They didn't seem to notice the change in me. I was still pleasant, still helpful. I played my role, but my internal script had been completely rewritten. I was no longer observing their actions. I was gathering data. They never asked if the basement was cold, if the mattress hurt my back, if I felt lonely. They didn't ask because my comfort was irrelevant to their objective. Their greatest miscalculation was assuming my silence was weakness and that I had nowhere else to go. One morning, while they were at work and Molly was at school, I took the portfolio from my suitcase again. I sat at the kitchen table and, with the steady hands of the accountant I had once been, I photographed every single page of the documents, the deed, the mortgage, the tax records. I uploaded the photos to a secure cloud drive and copied them onto a small flash drive, which I then tucked into a hidden pocket in my wallet. The original papers went back into the portfolio, and the portfolio went back into the suitcase. I wasn't just preparing for a fight, I was building my case. My next step was a phone call. I looked up the number for Arthur Vance, an old colleague of David's, a semi-retired real estate lawyer who had helped us with the original purchase of this very house. His voice was gravelly but kind when he answered. He remembered me, asked after my health, and offered his condolences for David, even though it had been years. I thanked him, but I told him I wasn't calling to reminisce. I laid out the situation for him, calmly and factually. The house in my name, my son and his wife living in it, their recent behavior. I asked him a simple question. What would it take for me to reclaim full and sole possession of my property? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Arthur's voice came back, stripped of its folksy warmth, now sharp and professional. Clara, he said, legally, it's already yours. It would take a formal eviction notice and a good locksmith. He walked me through the steps, the legal notices required, the time frame. I wrote it all down on a clean sheet of paper, my handwriting neat and steady. I folded the paper and put it in my wallet, next to the flash drive. That night, I cleaned the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed. It had become my quiet ritual, a way to impose order on a small corner of a chaotic world. I wiped down the counters, loaded the dishwasher, and polished the stainless steel sink until it gleamed. Then I turned off the light and stood in the darkness, listening to the house settle. It was a different kind of listening now. I was no longer listening for signs of affection, but for confirmation of my own resolve. Back in my basement room, I took out a small notebook and a pen. I started a new ledger, not of debits and credits, but of facts. Date of arrival, amount paid for groceries, amount paid for car repair, amount requested for monthly contribution. Page after page, I documented the slow, methodical draining of my resources. Seeing it all written down in my own clear hand was validating. It wasn't an emotional outburst. It was an audit. I wasn't angry. I was organized. I had been living in a fog of misplaced hope and emotional manipulation. Now the fog was lifting, and I was beginning to see the hard, clear lines of the truth. I was taking back control, one number at a time. The invitation came on a Wednesday morning. A text from Heather. Have a break between clients at 11. Tea on the patio. Her use of emojis, a teacup, a smiling face, was a masterstroke of casual warmth. I knew exactly what it was. The final act. I texted back a simple, sounds lovely. She set the scene with her usual meticulous care. The patio table was laid with a linen cloth, delicate porcelain cups, and a plate of lemon lavender shortbread from the expensive downtown bakery. The tea was a fragrant jasmine green. She poured it with a steady hand, her movements graceful and deliberate. For a few minutes, we engaged in the familiar dance of small talk, the weather, a new shop opening in town, Molly's progress in her piano lessons. It was all a prelude, the soft music playing before the main event. Then, she slid a thick manila envelope across the table. My name was not on it. It was simply labeled Household Finances. Clara, she began, her voice a carefully modulated blend of sincerity and concern. Mason and I have been talking, and we think we've found a way to simplify things for everyone. It would just streamline the household accounts, make things more efficient. She opened the envelope and fanned out the documents inside. They were refinance applications, power of attorney forms, and a quitclaim deed that would transfer the title of the house from my name to theirs. She spoke of legacy planning and easing my burden. I let her finish. I picked up my teacup, took a slow, deliberate sip, and placed it back in its saucer with a soft click. I looked directly into her eyes, my gaze calm and unwavering. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the space between us with the weight of a stone. Heather blinked, her polished composure faltering for a fraction of a second. I don't think you understand, Clara. This is for the best. For the whole family. Mason has been so stressed. I understand perfectly, Heather, I interrupted, my voice still quiet but firm. I understand that you were hoping I would do what I've always done. Smile, nod, and sign whatever you put in front of me. I reached into my handbag, which I had placed on the chair beside me, and pulled out a single folded paper. It was a copy of the original deed to the house. I unfolded it and placed it on the table, directly on top of her stack of forms. My name, clear and irrefutable, was at the top. Her eyes flickered down to the paper, then back up to my face. The mask of serene control shattered, replaced by a look of stark disbelief. For the first time since I had arrived in this house, Heather was speechless. You and Mason have 30 days to make other living arrangements, I said, my voice gentle but absolute. I will be reclaiming my property. This is not a negotiation. She stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. The color drained from her face. Without another word, she gathered her papers, stood up stiffly, and walked back into the house, the screen door slamming shut behind her. I remained on the patio, the sun warm on my face. I took another sip of my tea. It had gone cold. A breeze rustled the leaves of the aspen trees in the yard, and the wind chimes sang their soft, indifferent song. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like taking a deep, clean breath after holding it for far too long. And in that moment, I knew I was finally, truly, coming home to myself. The next morning, the silence in the house was thick and heavy. Mason found me in the kitchen. He didn't greet me. He walked straight to the counter and placed the manila envelope, now looking slightly crumpled, between us. "Heather told me what you did," he said, his voice low and strained. "She said you've lost your mind, that you misunderstood everything." He pushed the folder toward me. "We were trying to secure this family's future. Our future. And you're trying to destroy it." I looked at him, my son, a man I barely recognized, his face a mask of self-righteous anger. I didn't touch the folder. I waited for him to finish his tirade about betrayal and how I was pulling the rug out from under them, how this house was more theirs than it had ever been mine. When he finally fell silent, breathing heavily, I opened a kitchen drawer and took out a plain white envelope I had prepared the night before. I placed it on the counter next to his. Inside was the ledger I had created, a neat, chronological list of every dollar I had contributed since my arrival. "I haven't misunderstood anything, Mason," I said, my voice steady. "I signed those mortgage papers 20 years ago to help you build a life, not to have my own life dismantled. I stood by you through bad credit and job losses. When the bank threatened to foreclose, who answered the phone? When you needed a down payment, whose savings did you use?" I let the questions hang in the air. Helping someone you love doesn't mean you cease to exist. Being a mother does not mean becoming a blank check. He stared at the white envelope, refusing to look at me. 30 days is not a punishment, I continued, my voice softening slightly. It's a boundary. It's the boundary you and Heather were so fond of talking about. I'm not asking for a single dollar back. I'm not looking for revenge. I am simply stepping out of a role I never agreed to play. I will always be your mother. I will always be here for Molly. But I will no longer fund a life where I am treated like a silent, invisible investor. He finally lifted his head and looked at me. The anger in his eyes had been replaced by something else, something that looked like dawning, horrified recognition. The fight seemed to drain out of him, leaving him looking tired and small. He nodded once, a jerky, defeated movement. He picked up his folder of papers and walked out of the kitchen without another word. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I felt a deep, piercing sadness. But beneath the sadness, there was a foundation of calm. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. As the morning sun streamed through the window, the kitchen, for the first time, felt like it could be mine again. The quiet was no longer a weapon used against me. It was a space I was reclaiming. For 2 days, Mason was a ghost in his own home. He moved through the rooms with a heavy, weighted silence, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't speak to me, but it wasn't the aggressive silence of punishment. It was the hollow silence of shame. Heather, on the other hand, carried on as if nothing had happened, a brittle, cheerful facade firmly in place. Her politeness was now tinged with a glassy, sharp edge. I saw the looks she shot Mason when she thought I wasn't watching, looks of frustration and command. He never met her gaze. On the 3rd morning, I found him in the garage. The large door was open, letting in the cool morning air and the scent of pine. He was standing by the old workbench, staring at a tangled heap of power tools and rusted garden shears. He wasn't fixing anything. He was just standing there, his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat that I recognized from his teenage years, from a time before life had taught him to mask his vulnerabilities. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before he seemed to notice me. The silence stretched between us, filled with 20 years of unspoken truths. "How long were you planning this?" he asked, his voice rough. I didn't answer. The question wasn't the point. "I thought you came here to be with us," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "To be a family." "I did," I said softly. "I still want that. But family has to be a circle, Mason, not a one-way street." He nodded slowly, a small, tired gesture of acknowledgement. He kicked at a loose stone on the concrete floor. "I know," he whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "I know it went too far. The asking, the pressure." He said it without looking at me, His confession offered to the dusty air of the garage, not to me. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was just a statement of fact, stripped of all excuses. In that moment, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt a wave of profound grief for what we had lost, for the son I remembered and the man he had become. It was the sorrow of finally being seen, but only after the damage was irreversible. "I'm not leaving because I stopped loving you, Mason," I told him, and the words were truer than anything I had said in weeks. "I'm leaving because I finally started to remember how to love myself." He didn't respond. He just stood there, a solitary figure in the cavernous garage. I turned to go back into the house. As I reached the door, he spoke one last time, his voice filled with a strange kind of wonder. "I always just assumed you'd be here," he said. "No matter what." I paused, but I didn't turn around. I held on to that sentence, carried it with me back down to the basement that would not be mine for much longer. He hadn't asked me to stay. He hadn't tried to fix it. But he had, in his own broken way, finally told the truth. He had taken my presence for granted. He had seen me as a permanent fixture in his life, as immovable as the mountains outside his window. It wasn't closure, and it wasn't healing. But it was honest. And for the first time, I felt like that was enough. The night before I was scheduled to move, I packed my few belongings. The process was quick and quiet. Most of my things had never truly been unpacked, remaining in neat piles in my suitcase, as if my subconscious had known all along that this was not a place to put down roots. I folded the shirts, paired the socks, zipped the small compartments with a steady, unhurried hand. There was no anger left, no bitterness. There was only the quiet resolve of a decision made and seen through. I stripped the thin mattress and folded the sheets neatly at the foot of the metal frame, leaving the space exactly as I had found it. Upstairs, the house was still. A profound and final silence had fallen. Mason had retreated to the garage again. Heather had closed their bedroom door hours earlier. Molly was at a sleepover. There would be no dramatic goodbyes, no tearful final scene. It was a clean, quiet excision. Before I went down to the basement for the last time, I placed a sealed envelope on the kitchen island. Inside was a short, handwritten letter. I did not rehash old wounds or assign blame. I simply wrote that I wished them both well, that I hoped they would find a way to build a life on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. I wrote that I was not walking away in anger, but walking toward peace. The next morning, I was gone before the sun rose. I wheeled my suitcase down the silent driveway, the clicking of the wheels on the pavement the only sound in the pre-dawn stillness. I did not look back at the house. There was nothing there for me anymore. A taxi was waiting for me at the end of the street, just as I had arranged. The driver was a kind-faced man who loaded my bag without a word and kept the radio turned down low. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked down at my hands, resting in my lap. They felt light, unburdened. They were not reaching for anything, nor were they clenched in a fist. They were simply at rest. I had no grand plan, no detailed itinerary for the rest of my life. But in my pocket was the key to a small, one-bedroom apartment across town, and for now, that was more than enough. My departure was not a storm. It was the quiet ceasing of the rain. It was the simple, powerful act of a woman picking up what was hers and walking away, not because she was unwanted, but because she had finally remembered her own worth. The apartment was modest, but it was mine. The afternoon sun streamed through the living room window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and warming the old wooden floors. I unpacked my boxes slowly, deliberately. I hung the photos of David and me on the wall. I arranged my mother's china in the small glass-fronted cabinet. I filled the bookshelf with the novels that had been my companions for years. Each small act was an affirmation, a reclaiming of my own life, my own space. I discovered the quiet joys of solitude again. I took long walks in the nearby park, sat on a bench by the duck pond, and simply watched the world go by. I was not lonely. I was at peace. I found a flyer at the local library for a financial literacy workshop for senior women. I went, not because I needed the advice, but because I needed the community. I sat at a folding table with a dozen other women, all with their own stories etched into the lines on their faces. We talked about budgets and savings, but we also talked about sons and daughters, about the quiet ways we had allowed ourselves to shrink to fit into other people's lives. For weeks, I just listened. Then one day I spoke. I told my story. Not for sympathy, but for solidarity. A few women nodded in recognition. One reached across the table and briefly squeezed my hand. Mason sends me texts sometimes. Short, factual updates about Molly's school or his work. There are no apologies, but there is a new, hesitant respect in his tone. I reply when I feel ready. My response is brief but kind. I am building a new boundary, one made not of anger, but of healthy distance. I no longer feel the need to be understood by people who were never willing to see me. The life I am building is not the one I imagined on that long bus ride to Flagstaff. It is smaller, quieter, and infinitely more my own. What I carried out of that house was not resentment. It was my name, my dignity, and the profound, life-altering knowledge that true peace is not something you are given. It is the home you build inside yourself, for yourself. If this story has found you, perhaps it is because you, too, have felt the quiet chill of being taken for granted or the slow erosion of your own boundaries. Perhaps you are standing at a crossroads, wondering if you have the strength to choose a different path. I hope my story serves as a gentle reminder that your strength has been there all along, waiting patiently for you to claim it. I would love to know what part of this journey resonated with you and where it found you in your own.